Hey there, let's talk about sound in film, especially about intertext. Let's maybe first ask ourselves, how does sound in film create meaning? When analyzing sound in film, be it music, speech, sound effects, or just ambient noise, we can analyze many different characteristics, beginning with simple perceptual properties like loudness, pitch, and timbre, through more complex properties like the relationship between the visual and the auditory, to even bigger concepts just like aesthetic and narrative functions of sound. But that doesn't yet solve our problem. How do we get from simple auditory properties to complex meanings? Well, I'd say the answer is the referential nature of sound. And before I said that, David Bordwell, an American film theorist, wrote about it in his 1989 book, Making Meaning: Inference and Rhetoric in the Interpretation of Cinema. He argues that in order to make sense of any film, we have to understand its references. So, let's talk about intertextuality in film sound. Close your eyes, or I'll just turn off the picture. Did you recognize this famous scene just from the soundtrack? That's right, it's from the 1960s movie Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. What? Oh really? Okay, let's watch it again, this time with the image. Admit it, some of you were tricked. Well, that's okay. The original scene from Psycho is a prime example for intertextual relations between films, or in this case, TV series. The original scene has been referenced many times, and even if you've never seen the original, you're likely to know its meaning. It's a landmark scene of horror movies, completely unexpected and shocking. Remember, this is the protagonist being murdered halfway into the movie. And the soundtrack, the high-pitched violin screech, has absorbed much of this meaning into itself. The Simpsons used this intertextual reference as a kind of media-reflective comedy, as they often do. But there are films which use the same reference in quite different ways. Let's take a look at the 2008 found footage film Home Movie. This scene might also appear like a funny, comedic play with a famous scene, but it actually does much more than that. It acts as a foreshadowing to the horror which is about to take over the atmosphere of this film. Even simpler, the film Stalked from 1994 uses part of this iconic sound design in its opening credits.
This is the story of Daryl Gleason.
It tries to draw directly from the notions of fear and horror we associate with this dissonant progression of tones. But as you probably noticed by now, the term intertextuality is quite broad in meaning and sometimes hard to grasp. For that reason, it makes sense to have a look at John Fiske's classification of intertextuality, which he published in his book Television Culture in 1987. According to him, there are two types: horizontal and vertical intertextuality. Horizontal intertextuality is pretty much what we've been looking at so far, a relation between two texts on the same medial level. So, one fictional film soundtrack referencing another fictional film soundtrack. Vertical intertextuality, on the other hand, describes a kind of intertextuality between different media levels. Let's look at the 2009 film Inglourious Basterds. Listen closely to the music playing in the background.
Danke.
Kennen Sie den Namen des Sprösslings denn schon?
Jawohl. Fräulein, sein Name ist Maximilian.
Maximilian, das ist aber ein schöner Name.
Ja. Danke.
It's quite faint, but still recognizable. A popular German song from the 1930s. In this case, the intertextual sound is only part of a bigger construct of many historic references. After all, this fictional narrative is set during the real Second World War. But researching further, you can find that this German song itself is actually out of a German 1936 movie called Glückskinder.
Ich wollt, ich wär ein Huhn, ich hätt nicht viel zu tun. Ich leg des Morgens nur ein Ei und nachmittags wär ich frei.
Wenn du nachmittags sagst, musst du auch Vormittag sagen.
Was hab ich denn gesagt?
Du sagst morgens.
Nur wenn er morgens sein Ei legt, dann ist der Vormittag sowieso hin.
Ich brauchte nie.
Here, the distinction vertical and horizontal intertextuality comes to its limits. I'd still say the relation in this case is vertical, because Inglourious Basterds is not referencing the usage of the song in the movie, but rather its importance as a well-known German song. A more clear example for vertical intertextuality would be a fictional film using a pop song out of the real world. To introduce and characterize, the filmmakers are using a song which already carries a lot of meaning with it. Instead of having to explain the nature of Julia Steele's character in 10 Things I Hate About You, they just have a listen to a song called Bad Reputation by Joe and Jet. Easy. The song already carries the meaning and the filmmakers can bring it to their fictional story. Of course, the concept of intertextuality doesn't only apply to such direct references. Looking back at the original term, we can see that the scope of intertextual influences is almost infinite. Every text is, from the outset, under the jurisdiction of other discourses which impose a universe on it, says Julia Kristeva, a Bulgarian-French literary critic, sociologist and philosopher who introduced the term intertextuality in 1966. What she means is basically that every text contains a collection of references to other texts without which it would not be able to create meaning. Of course, this isn't to say that other mechanisms such as the pure musical codes don't contribute to the meaning of a specific film scene. Claudia Gorman, professor of film studies for example, defines the 3 codes by which film music creates meaning. Pure musical codes, cultural musical codes and cinematic musical codes. Let's look at this scene from the 2011 film Samsara and see how these 3 codes can be applied and how they interact with the concept of intertextuality. The music here carries emotion and meaning through its slow and sad melody on the one hand, which can be classified as pure musical codes, but it goes beyond that. The song is a Swedish lullaby, and for those viewers who are able to decode this cultural reference, the meaning of this scene is further expanded. These cultural and cinematic musical codes, as Claudia Gorman calls them, are the intertextual component of film sound. This also refers to things such as genre conventions and general filmic norms. For example, think of a typical Western soundtrack. Chances are you thought of this. But before Sergio Leone's 1968 film Once Upon a Time in the West, Western soundtracks sounded much more like this. Sometimes one film can exert exceptionally great intertextual influence on those coming after it, thereby noticeably changing genre conventions. What we can see is that much of the meaning of a soundtrack comes from its intertextual relations, and finding and understanding these relations, from genre conventions to specific songs, can be very important in analyzing film soundtracks. So, that's our introduction to intertextuality in film sound. And you thought I couldn't pronounce it.